Hey guys, it's Maria, and today we'll be talking about the process behind the experimental book design. Here you see the first prototype, and is basically where I decided how the pages would fold. It was a process of trial and error. There was some pre-planning in my sketchbook that went into before, making this. But here it's super messy. You just take a pencil out and you jot down any and all ideas you have about it. And it's a good way to plan things before you move on to getting test prints. Now, the second phase is getting test prints. So here I did opt for getting colored prints because I needed to make sure that the color was having the same impact that I had imagined. And then I had my second prototype, which creating this helped me really figure out how the book would eventually be constructed, because it was my first time doing bookbinding. And here I just use glue for bookbinding, so it's not that, since it's very thin paper, but it was a learning experience. And then here I ended up finding out the structure of the book, what worked, what didn't, and then I went on back to the software InDesign and Illustrator, and based on the things I learned from prototype 1 and prototype 2 about what to keep, what not to keep, what needs to change, I did make the appropriate changes on InDesign and Illustrator. And here you can see the process on the software for my final. So since this was an experimental book design and the pages weren't straightforward, right? There were lots of folds, as you could see in the prototype. So I had to keep going back and forth between InDesign and Illustrator. On InDesign, which by the way I love working on, you can get your margins down, you can get the basic layout down. It helped me really figure out what the pages would look like before you open the flaps, right? What you see at first glance on a lot of the pages. And then in Illustrator, because I had already made the prototypes, I knew how large my flaps would be, what would be required. So here I am creating the flaps for the I am confident, assertive, and curious pages. And it was an iterative process, which just means that you go through a lot of variations and versions of the same design, and that can be said for the entire book. There is a lot of back and forth, but also just any design that you might end up doing. Settling on the first thing that you do is never the best idea. So here it's just a bit of an inside behind the scenes of how much chaos almost went on trying to figure out what composition goes where, what the size of the text, the spacing, the composition, colors was a really tricky thing, because in this project we were only allowed to use one color other than black and white. So picking which color to highlight the personality of the interrobang, the punctuation mark that the book is based on, was tricky at first, but then figuring out how much of an impact the color will have was even trickier. So it was constant revisions in the process. And there's also maintaining balance was a very key aspect of designing this book, because you have three really high contrasting colors, black, white, and shocking pink. And since it was an experimental book design and there's so many flaps, there had to be a balance of when to keep it simple, when to add a flap, what here you see the flap with enthusiastic written on it. So in my prototypes, it was opening out differently. It was opening out horizontally, like just on the page. But then, because enthusiastic is enthusiastic, you need a lot of energy. So then I ended up opting for the vertical layout for that, the vertical flap. And I did the same thing for excitement. And it's this book design was a really good way of figuring out where you want your type to scream almost, and where you want it to be, like subtle, and it's just someone speaking to you, and then versus someone being super excited. So it was that like back and forth, and that balance, especially since the interrobang is a combination of a question mark and exclamation mark, so that was really important. As far as the fonts are concerned, so I used Magic Retro and Terif, since this wasn't a commercial project. Like, we could use any font. So with that, it's, like, both of the fonts have their distinct personalities, and that really helped in figuring out, okay, so one font represents the qualities and the personality of the question mark, versus the other one represents the excitement, enthusiasm, and like the really the loudness almost of the exclamation mark. And that's how that's another way that I tried to incorporate balance, is the interplay of the fonts. Here, this spread was the most experimental in terms of it's simple in design, but it took a lot of planning and figuring out just the right spot for the punctuation mark, because cropping things off your artboard or canvas can get really tricky, because sometimes you can make some really weird shapes. But yeah, so it's just a process of you design, you take some steps back, you get some feedback, you have other people look at it, and once you have enough distance from it, then you kind of get an idea of what's working, what's not. This was another challenging spread. This wasn't the text or the layout, the spread wasn't in any of the previous prototypes, but during my critique, I was told that it feels abrupt. So it was a way of concluding the book and bringing you back to what the book was actually about, and how it's about both myself and the punctuation mark that we're talking about. So another challenge with creating the flaps on Illustrator was that there were just so many guides on the screen, and the way I did work around it was sometimes I just make these rectangles that are color coded. It's just easier to see them, and because they're all the same size, and then I can just place them around like a frame. And then it also helps me with margins on Illustrator, because sometimes I try to keep my guides for the basic margins on the artboard, but if I'm designing off the artboard, I try to prefer, I do prefer using rectangles or something to keep it consistent, and the bright colors just remind me to take it off. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for this. These are the prototypes and the final book for the presentation, and please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week.